Bible because you'll see spirit with a little s and spirit with a big S. But whether they capitalized those or not was not inspired. That part of it was come in the translation. And so there's sometimes when we have spirit, that it may be the spirit of God, it may be the spirit of man, or it may be the spirit, we see different.
Well, isn't it sometimes our soul?
There's a little bit of a delineation, I think, from Hebrews that says, that it's two-edged, where God is two-edged sword, able to divide the spirit and the soul. Sometimes I think but it's hard it's hard not to say that when Adam was created that he didn't have the Spirit of God in him, because that's now then it does say that when then Adam created a son in his own likeness. And then we have the thing from Genesis 6 where we talk about the sons of God saw the daughters of God seem to be the ones that had the Spirit of God in them, and that means that some men, not all flesh, had the Spirit of God in them. Some men didn't have that Spirit.
I've read also that, and some scholars think that the likeness of God creating man in his likeness deals more with our spirit than it does with our physical flesh.
I would agree with that.
Part of us that's like God is our spirit. None of the animals have that. We have animals that look similar to a person, being an ape or something like that, but animals don't have the spirit that mankind has. And so therefore, we're like God in that way.
There was one more thing regarding spirit in John where it talks about spirit. It can mean wind as well.
It can mean wind. Yeah, that's pneuma is the Greek term. Yeah, it's the Greek. And you have to determine from the context whether we're talking about spirit or whether we're talking about wind or breath too. But man was a dual creature. We see flesh and spirit coming together into one being. But spirit is always stronger than flesh, as we'll see as we go through this lesson. This is what I'm trying to show, is that spirit is always stronger than flesh. Whenever it's God doing the creating or God doing the thing, that is always him doing things for man or with man, never the other way around. So it's always the spirit that is stronger than the flesh. But perhaps that was the weakness.
The thing of it is, we have the Spirit of God dwelling in us, according to Romans. And I think sometimes it would be very difficult living in Moses' time to understand this passage. But we have some explanation to it. Just like you brought up Genesis 6, talking about the sons of God. Paul says that all who live by the flesh are flesh. All who led by the Spirit are the sons of God. So it's what we're going to follow.
Yeah.
And now Adam and Eve had the Spirit of God dwelling in them and striving to do what was right, just as we have it today. But that Spirit did not control them as far as that. When we get into the Spirit and the soul is that life force that we have. That Spirit is our personal desires and what we do. We control it. That's truly who we are.
That's the spirit with the little s.
With the little s. Yeah. We have that free will.
So in Genesis 6:3, God says, let's get Genesis 6:3 up here. I didn't, where's my Bible? I'm going to use it instead of this electronic. 6:3, what did God say? My spirit will not abide with man forever. My spirit will not contend with man forever. Yeah, I think it's some translations.
And what he's saying is, my spirit will not, all men will always not, will not always be willing to follow my spirit.
So, because he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. Isaiah 31. Isaiah 31 starts talking about a spirit and a whole different spirit. Isaiah 31:3. The Egyptians are man, not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. So what he's saying is, in poetic form, is that I'm God, I'm spirit, I'm stronger than flesh. The horses are flesh. Just because Egypt has chariots doesn't mean that you're going to get run over. I'm spirit, they're flesh. In Joel, we read that famous passage that Peter repeated at Pentecost. In those days, in those latter days, at the end of Judaism, when the church was beginning, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. So somewhere between Genesis and Pentecost, not everybody had the Spirit of God in them. And that's where we get that idea that when it says the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that the sons of God are the people that have the Spirit of God dwelling in them. The others were just men.
That doesn't mean they didn't have the opportunity. They chose.
Well, yeah, we're not talking about the opportunity part of it. That comes in the decision. Yeah, that comes in the decision making. We're just talking right now whether spirit is stronger than flesh, which is man's weakness. Is his flesh weakness? God made man into flesh. Did he make him imperfect by making him flesh? No. So the flesh isn't necessarily the weakness.
Yeah, it is. Because the flesh is what draws us away from the Spirit of God. It's given into our lust of flesh. The Spirit we have that controls our lives. If we follow God's Spirit, and that's what Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 8.
But the sneeze isn't the cold.
No, it
The
isn't.
sneeze is just a symptom.
But what we
The
give
flesh, I think we'll see, is going to be a symptom of the weakness. The law was spiritual, but it was made weak by the flesh.
Okay, what did you just say?
And then Matthew
I was a made weak.
told them when they were falling asleep that the spirit try to stay awake and keep going because the spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. So it looks like right now, we know spirit is stronger than flesh. It looks like flesh is the weakness that's built into man. Okay, stay with me. Eternal versus temporary. The tree of life was in the garden. All the trees that man could that had the seed in them, man could eat of. God didn't need to eat. The tree of life, in order to stay alive, man had to eat. It's interesting, later on, we'll see the tree of life in heaven. The tree of then his days is 120 years. That passage always gets confusing with whether Noah preached for 120 years or whether it took 120 years for him to build the ark, or whether man's life expectancy was going to be 120 years after this flood was over. We do see a dramatic drop off in age after the flood. And then by the time we're to David, man's years are 70, maybe a little bit more because of hell. But we can observe every day created things die or dead. So we see that temporary is weaker than eternal. We can't continue, trees don't continue to live for thousands and thousands and thousands of years and are still the trees today that God planted in the earth, that created in the earth when he started. So we know that everything around us dies. We see all of Genesis chapter 5. Man lived X number of years, and then the last phrase out of every one of those verses is, and he died.
And of course, it raises the question, if man had never sinned in the garden, then there would not have been death introduced to the world. It seems like to me, anyway, that there would not be death introduced. So, in that case, man would have lived forever in the garden and his offspring. If sin was never introduced. And so, also, the creation itself would have continued living, would not have faced death, like the trees died. It would have been this perfect place. Now, that's just all speculation.
Yeah.
It's not scripture. I would say it's not, I can't find scripture based on that, but thinking of the overview of sin being introduced, the falling away, that sort of thing, has death into the picture as we see it with mankind. And I think probably, in my mind, it would also affect nature itself.
This is chapter 3. At the end of it, after all the pronunciation of everything that's going to happen to the sin, God puts man out of the garden with the statement, lest he eat of the tree of life and live forever. He took that access to it away from him. Whatever it was, it sustained man with everything he needed to live forever. So once God took that away, all mankind was affected. The earth itself was affected by the curse that God put upon it because of man.
And of course, that also leads to the heavenly home that we're looking to when God restores his relationship with man that he had in the beginning. I think that's kind of the gist of heaven, is that it's going to be like this paradise that God started with. So that him and man can have this relationship, one-on-one, walk in the garden, walk together and talk, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think God designed us to be temporary. We will be eternal, but he planted in there the tree of life. Man had to eat of it in order to stay alive. Once he got cut off from the tree of life, there's no way he could live forever. Still lived a long time, but then we see after the flood that even got shorter.
Yeah, but sin had already been introduced.
But man started to realize that he was temporary. Dust to dust, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, the dust will return to the dust. In Genesis, even David said, Abraham realized that he was dust. David realized our frame is but dust. And Ecclesiastes, all are dust, and the dust returns to the dust, and the spirit returns to the God who gave it. It begs the question then, why ever trust in something made of dust over someone that's eternal. Something or someone that's made of dust over someone that's eternal. Eve was tempted by a created being. There should be a conversation there other than God told us not to eat of the tree. End of conversation.
Should have been.
He's the spirit. He's the creator. You're just a created being. Why are we even having this conversation? There was something there that made her listen to another created being.
Well, that created being, being the devil, actually convinced Eve that he was wiser and knew God better than she did.
Yeah, the conversation was probably a little bit more than what we. Okay, let's look at omniscience versus finite knowledge. Spirit is always stronger than flesh, but not all spiritual beings are omniscient. Only God and the Trinity have the omniscience, the all-knowing. The devil doesn't know everything, even though he's spirit and he's been around what seems to us forever, at least since the beginning of time, if not before. But we realize that our knowledge is finite. So maybe that's our weakness. We just don't have, I think experts say that we use, 10% of the capacity of our brain? Maybe God intended us to use 100% of it, but because of our choices, it's gotten less and less over the years. And he talks about, destroying the wisdom of the wise and the man of this age, whereas a debater of this age. I mean, even trying to, we know that we're made out of dust, but when you get sick, how do you die? We guess what we got. We can't diagnose ourselves. God knows that we're sick. He knows whether we got COVID or whether we got the flu. All of the symptoms look the same to us, but we're just guessing based on the symptoms that we see. So our knowledge is so finite, even of ourselves, that we realize that God's knowledge and the knowledge that we see that has been presented to us from His Word is way stronger and way more than we could ever hope to attain. So our confidence needs to be in that again and not in ourselves.
Ron, when God drives them out, he says he's going to drive them out because they eat the spirit and live, eat of the tree and live forever. It seems to me, if he had not done that, they might have lived forever in their sin. And that was one of the, I guess,
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
there's something.
Live forever in your sin, because if he hadn't have drove him out and put that block there, he would have been a sinful man living forever. That's interesting. Deuteronomy 29:29. Well, Proverbs, David said, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The knowing, the respect and the awe and just downright fear of who God is, that's the beginning of knowledge, what God calls knowledge. Not what necessarily man calls knowledge. Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to God. Those things that have been revealed are ours and our children's forever. So the stuff that's been revealed, we know. But this is not even hardly a glimpse of God. I mean, this is all God has given us, just enough for us to make the choice between us and Him, that He's given us, as Peter would say, everything we need for godliness and life. Job 34, Job 34:21. His eyes are on man. Let the rest of it out. His eyes are on the ways of a man, and he sees all of his steps. We can't see past 10 o'clock. Our steps all the way. So we know that his knowledge is way stronger than ours. So is it our knowledge that causes our weakness? Paul would say of the Jews, they are zealous for God, but without knowledge. So the knowledge that they had was what was causing them to stumble. Elton, you had something you wanted to say.
Well, the weakness, I believe, comes from the lack of knowledge of God, not just plain knowledge of Him. You know, because we all have a lot of knowledge about a lot of different things. But if we don't have knowledge of God, the Bible itself says that people are lost due to a lack of knowledge.
Due to a lack of knowledge.
And knowledge of God, knowledge of the workings of God.
And the only ways that we can, well, we're all without excuse, because in Romans he says that you can see God's eternal power and his divine nature from what's already been made. But what he has revealed about himself in this book is the only way that we have of knowing. We can't just think up what is God like. That's how we came up with idols. Everybody wanted to think up what God was like, and they made God in their own image, or the image that they wanted, and they made a whole host of heaven and everything. Can you imagine Moses? I'll get to you in just a second now. Can you imagine Moses? He's taught in all of the ways of Egypt. They had evolution, they had multiple gods, they had all the ways that the earth was created and the heavens and the stars. And then God sits him down and starts with Genesis. Moses had to be blown away by that kind of revelation, because it would have been completely different than what he had learned. Now,
when we talk about that weakness and that flesh and thing of knowledge and everything, it all comes back, what do you want to know? People that want to know God find God. There's that point there where we realize in Genesis chapter 4, when you see Cain and his lineage, it says Cain went out from the presence of God. It wasn't God that turned his back on Cain. Cain turned his back on God. Cain did not want to have to serve God. He did not want to follow through his own lineage. When you flip to that, and you go into where it tells at the end of that chapter that Adam begat Seth, who was born to replace Abel and Cain's food. It says, and at that time men began calling upon the name of the Lord. Those are the ones that wanted to know God. And that comes back to, how much do we want to know God?
and that's the perfect segue into our next one, is man's free will his weakness. Free moral agent. God created us in his image, and I believe this is where Calvin made a mistake. Calvin didn't believe that God was a free moral agent, that he could not sin. So he was sovereign. He didn't have, God never had choices. God was God. Everything was laid out. And so God was not a free moral agent, therefore man wasn't a free moral agent, and that's where I think in my reading anyway, I think that's the first domino that Calvin got wrong that caused everything else that he came up with to fall. We can see all the way from the very beginning, men making choices. Genesis, God said, you have a choice. You may eat of everything that I've created for you to eat, but this tree, you may not eat of it. That automatically infers that man had a choice of whether to eat of that tree or not. He would never have to have said, you can't eat of that tree, if we couldn't have chosen to eat of that tree. It would have been totally unnecessary to say, don't eat of that tree, if we didn't have the ability to make that decision.
Ron, it also shows how important loyalty and obedience is to God. He wants us to choose that.
He wants us to choose that, and I think that's the whole purpose of this test that we're in. We are a royal priesthood, chosen before the foundation of the world, chosen to speak the thing, the wonders of God and all of that.
Also, Ron, I'd like to point out, give some insight, to remember that God has his redemptive plan before the beginning. It's in eternity. It's in the mind of God.
Yeah.
Jeremiah 10, chapter 10, verse 23 reminds us it is not in man to direct our steps. He knew Adam was going to see.
Yeah.
God directs our steps. Man's going to get in trouble wherever he goes without God. Jeremiah reminded us that it's not in man to direct his steps. That's why he made that plan.
That's where this comes in.
No, he didn't
That was a choice that Adam made. It wasn't the fact that God made us free moral agents that was our weakness. It was the ability, the fact that we now had
Yeah, I think
the
we're
ability
agreeing.
and the power
I think we're
to
agreeing.
choose between two different
Right, but he
things.
still reminds us, Jeremiah, it's not in man. It wasn't in Adam to direct his own steps.
Right.
God was there to direct him. Without God, Adam's lost.
Adam's lost. Yeah.
Proverbs says 14:25, there's a way that seems right unto man, but the ends
That's
thereof
where it leads to
is
death.
death.
That's why he has the plan.
Well,
Okay.
it was man's choice. The free moral agent issue that God created man in is a key to salvation also. You know, that was what he was trying, he created a being that had the ability to worship him if that being chose to, and that's what he wanted. He wanted, apparently, by his creation, he wanted a being that could have a choice and would want to worship him, as opposed to those that were in heaven, those angels and stuff that were in heaven. They were free moral agents also, but they had all the evidences that God had created was who he said he is. They saw it because they were amongst him. Now, that doesn't prove, but we see even the devil himself, because of his mindset, he sinned against God there in heaven. I can't even comprehend that. But yet he did it. But he wanted to create a being that could choose and worship him, and therein lies not only damnation, but also lies salvation.
And thus we are created in his image because he wanted that relationship. I think we're all agreeing. We're just saying it in different ways.
Different ways. Yeah, we're coming to the same conclusion. And that's what I hoped for. I didn't know how I was gonna bring all of this down to the same thing, but, yes.
It seems like this free moral agency is limited. Because no man can control the tongue.
I would,
No man can keep from lying. Paul did what he didn't want to do and did what he didn't want to do. There is a limit.
there's a limit to it this way. God, we have ability to choose between things that we see, we don't have the ability to make up what those choices are gonna be. In other words, Moses told the Israelites, I have set before you today life and death. Choose life. We have the power to choose between life and death. We don't have the power to make up a third option that we get to choose between.
But that
We
doesn't,
only get to choose between the options that God gives us to choose between. And that's how he directs our steps, because we don't have the power to make up a third choice in that. It's either life or it's death.
but again, it's limited because no man can control the tongue, so you don't have a choice there. I mean, it's to get you regardless. I mean, you have the choice to choose to control it, but it's not gonna always work.
I think it's a good lesson because it shows like we choose to be here, to worship him, to follow him. And it helps people out there that are questioning, you know, that they can choose to.
Yeah. Yeah, some people think they don't have a choice.
It's a relationship between them and God. We're just here to encourage each other. But the walk is with God, the relationship is with God, and they can choose.
Exactly, that's good.
Well, isn't one of the bottom line statements for this discussion, the simple fact that, you don't want God, he doesn't want you. And I'm thinking about a verse in the latter part of the book of Jeremiah, which says that. He told Jeremiah not to pray to him anymore about the people because they had rejected Jeremiah, therefore they rejected God.
Yeah, that's the only one place in the Bible here that God tells Jeremiah, stop praying for somebody. That was,
Well,
and then John said, yeah.
It comes back to the point what God was telling Jeremiah is, you need to be content to understand that they have set their faith.
So Proverbs 129 says they hated knowledge. That's why they did not choose the fear of the Lord. They hated knowledge. They would have none of my counsel and despised all of my reproof. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their ways. That's the free moral agency that leads to this. Temptation versus sin. Temptation is not sin. Sin is a result of the free moral agent deciding to ignore the knowledge that's there that tells him not to choose that, and he decides he wants to choose that, and so then that's what leads a man's desires to choose what he desires and not what God desires, because he didn't choose the fear of the Lord. And that leads to sin, and then that leads to death. James says, let no man say when he is tempted that I'm being tempted by God. So temptation is not from God. It's got to be coming from a created thing. Hebrews said, I meant to do that. Let's turn to Hebrews chapter 4, 15, or if somebody knows it, just bring it out. Hebrews 4:15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who has in every respect been tempted as we are, yet without sin. And that's where he's talking about Christ being our high priest, and he had been made flesh so that he could be tempted in all the ways that we were, but without sin. 1 Corinthians no temptation is overtaking you that isn't just common to man. But we know that when we see it, it's not from God. This is interesting.
Well, one thing right there. That's the verse that we go to. You're not tempted of God. But Christ himself said, lead us not into temptation. So the fact that you can't be tempted of God doesn't mean that he's not going to let the devil put temptation in front of him.
That's right. Because even Christ was tempted.
But as it says in 1 Corinthians 10:13, which you quoted the latter part, that with each temptation, God will provide a way of
Provide a
escape.
way of escape.
So it doesn't mean we have to succumb to temptation. It's again that free moral agency. Do we choose to give in to temptation, or we choose the way of escape that God gave?
Isn't it odd how uncreative the devil is? He used the same argument with the first Adam as he used with the second Adam.
Well, he's limited. He's got what?
Look at it, and then John summarized it all for us in his epistle. But in Genesis, he made the argument it's good for food, it's a delight to the eyes, and it can make you wise like God. When he tempted Jesus, he did that, turned the stones into bread. Look at all of these kingdoms. Throw yourself down because the scriptures say the angels will bear you up. All of those fall into one of those three categories that John says: the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, and the pride of life.
But that goes back into that point of him being limited. He only knows what has worked with man. And that's the thing that James is trying to point out to us, that it's our desires that the devil used. If we would control our desires, the devil couldn't tempt us. Bill had his hand up.
Oh,
He's got those three things to deal with. He's got nothing else.
yeah,
He said,
that's what it boils down to. That's where it all boils down to, whether man is going to choose, or whether he's going to choose to follow God. Whether he's going to desire the things that God desired. Jesus summarized it like this: not my will, but your will.
but man is destined to fail. I mean, the person that says he has no sin is lying. So, but we have some.
Man on his own is destined to fail, but Jesus made it possible for man not to fail if we choose him. Go ahead.
This is the thing. You can have godly sorrow, and you can repent, and you can ask for forgiveness, and be forgiven. That's what we got.
That's right. We choose to follow him and his instructions and his will instead of our own. So it's all of those things that inherent in us that give us the ability to choose right or wrong.
Could it be,
Whether,
could it be as simple as following is optional, stumbling is not?
Yeah.
Following is optional,
yeah,
but you're gonna stumble.
you're going to stumble because
We're children, we're not full grown, in that sense.
our knowledge is finite.
I mean, we're given the option, we're shown the path, we have something to look at, we can either go that direction or not. As long as we're going that direction, there's a good chance we're gonna fall down. That's just part of being us.
Yeah.
And that's part of also what keeps us dependent on God, because if we could not fall down, then we'd be really full of ourselves,
That's exactly a good point.
And as soon as you think you're not falling down, you probably have made yourself God. And if you give up on following, you probably turned into an animal. So that's kind of the options.
Yeah.
You can follow and probably fall down occasionally, or not follow and turn into something ugly.
That's a good way to put it. That's a good way to put it. You gotta make those decisions every single day. Am I gonna follow what's eternal? Or am I gonna look at what's temporary? Am I gonna follow what's, or am I gonna follow what's flesh? Romans 8 talks about those different weaknesses and things that we have, following the flesh, and if you follow the flesh, you end in death. Even obedience, and we're out of time, but even obedience, the difference between legalism and love is, I gotta do this, because it says to do this. Jesus said, I've gotta do this because this is the will of the Father. I want to do it. One is out of law, the other is out of love. And so even when you're choosing something good, the motive or the way that you go about it is if this is God's choice, and I'm going to stumble because my knowledge is finite. I see what's temporary a lot easier than I see what's eternal. I set my mind on things of this world instead of things in the heavens. I worry about what, in Corinthians 7, I worry about how to please my wife instead of how to please God, and so I'm conflicted, and so those things are going to happen.
God does not desire a robot.
Right, and we can see that with this.
And Jerry would have little respect for me if I had a noose around my neck and I faltered in the least way, that noose would tighten up and I'd be gone. But she wants me to care for her because that's my desire. Same with God. It's our desire to love and to worship and to obey instead of
And I think that's the difference we see between grace and law. When we say we're not under law, we're under grace and stuff. The difference between love and legalism. If you followed 100% every one of those things, you could live. But nobody, like Stephen said, we're going to stumble. God wants us to follow him out of love. Obey from the heart, obey out of love. Anyway, I ran you over.
I like his analogy.
Sharing with other people.
One more?
So I like his analogy. There's a difference between a noose and a halter.
Larry, you got it.
I got one question. I have trouble with the Holy Spirit rather than the man or his conscience. So I kind of, I need to know the difference because I know when I'm doing something wrong, and it feels like if my conscience comes in and says, Larry, that's wrong, you don't want to do it. And I say, okay, I won't do it. Is that the Holy Spirit, or is that my conscience doing that? What the Bible talks about sharing their conscience, several times. I'm just wondering how the Holy Spirit works in a man. Is that his conscience or what?
yes, it is.
Yes.
Yes, no, and maybe. That's one of those things that well, it's one of those things that we'd have to do a lesson on. And we might be able to come across